Okay, because it is part of an ongoing psychological operation on YouTube, I want to talk just a little bit more about the alleged reincarnation soul trap. First of all, one of the main things that you will hear about the alleged reincarnation soul trap is that it is the one subject that they don't want being discussed. And by contextualizing it in that way or branding it in that way, again, this is a form of marketing that's going on at all times. By branding it as the thing that no one wants us to talk about, implicitly, you are making the assumption that it is the ultimate truth. That's what you're conveying to somebody when you tell them that something is the one thing that cannot be talked about. This is a brief digression, but speaking of branding, a good way to tell whether or not someone is who they say they are is to pay attention to how they describe themselves. What I mean by that is what you are is self-evident, or at least it should be. You shouldn't need to remind everyone what you are all the time. That should just come through in whatever it is that you're doing, if you're a real, genuine, honest person. However, if you are playing a character or playing a role, it does make sense to brand yourself in certain ways. It does make sense to constantly refer to yourself as something. So you'll hear people, they will constantly reinforce what they are to their audience. Why? Because they're playing a character. They aren't really that, but they have to psychically drive that language into your mind so you, the naive viewer, start to believe that's what they are, even though their material and actions don't support that. But because they're so good with the language and the branding, they convince you that's what they are. So, brief digression, but something that I think is very useful to point out for those of you who are newer to all of this. So, what is the problem with alleging that this is the one thing that they don't want us to talk about? Well, it just so happens that the literal most famous conspiracy theorist, quote unquote, in the entire world just wrote his latest book on this subject and titled it The Trap. Okay? The most famous person pushed by all media as it relates to conspiracy theories wrote a book on the reincarnation soul trap. Now, I have not read it, so I don't know what he actually said. Meaning there could be some true things in there. That's how all disinformation works, of course. There's some truth in there with lies. So I don't know what he actually said, but the fact remains that the subject is very much out there and being promoted. Meaning someone coming on YouTube and pretending like they are so far beyond other people and advanced beyond other people because they know about this truth, quote unquote, and they have the courage to talk about it while other quote unquote shills don't. Well, you can kind of see how they are very much pretending to be something that they probably aren't, if that's what they're doing. If they can't see the obvious, that this subject is being promoted in every way that something can be promoted, pretending like they have some sort of secret truth that you don't have, we can start to see the signs of disingenuous behavior taking place. That's the first problem. Now, problem number 2 is, let's assume, for the sake of the thought experiment, that there actually is some kind of reincarnation soul trap. Because you could say, in response to the fact that David Icke wrote a book about this subject, well, hey, there are controlled assets who write books and do lectures on all kinds of real subjects, and their goal is to co-opt and control the narrative on that subject. And maybe that's what David Icke is doing with his book. That's plausible. He could be doing that. Again, thought experiment, this could be the actual truth of the situation that we are in. It's a reincarnation soul trap. And David Icke wrote that book as a way to co-opt the narrative and be the official person who is referred to whenever that subject is brought up. And of course, as I went into, there would be lies and truth about this subject then in that book, and it would discredit it at the same time that it discusses it. That's kind of how the game is played. So maybe that's what's going on with that book. I'm open to that possibility if this is the reality of the situation that we are in. But that being said, the next problem is if that is the reality of the situation that we are in, that means by default that reincarnation is a fact. The people discussing this idea just assume that is a fact for sure, when there are all kinds of spiritual traditions that do not agree that reincarnation exists. In other words, it's by no means settled that that is what is going on. But if we assume that there is some kind of trap involved in the reincarnation system, well, then by default you assume that reincarnation is real. Why is that a problem? Well, the overwhelming majority of entities who discuss this subject point to all of the quote-unquote evil that is taking place in nature and our lives in general as evidence for the idea that the God, quote-unquote, who created this world is not who we think it is. It is evil. They say, look at all of the suffering around us. Look at how brutal nature is. And we'll address the nature question in a second. Let's focus on the activity of human beings here in that environment. You say, look how horrific the world really is. Look at what's really going on. How can you justify a child with cancer and say that it's part of some learning experience, or you chose to come and experience that? Well, now hold on a second. Okay, right? If reincarnation is real and we are being recycled over and over again, there has to be some kind of rules to the system in the same way that a coder would set up a game that has certain parameters. You code the rules of the game into it. In that way, if reincarnation is real, then there has to be rules programmed into the foundation of that structure, which is referred to as karma. In other words, as the story goes in the context of this narrative, we are so powerful as true creator beings that they have to trick us into coming back into the prison that they have constructed around this creation. And the only way to trick us is to lean on the decisions that we made and the karma that those decisions accumulated or discharged. They have to sell us, going back to advertising and marketing, some kind of story to convince us to return. And then they wipe your memory and stick you back in here. Again, as the story goes. But in that scenario, I hope you see the salient point, which is even inside of this system, this theoretical prison that you have been placed in, you still have the free will to make decisions based on the rules of karma that they coded into the system. Meaning, a lot of the suffering that you witness all around you in people would be the direct results of what they did in prior incarnations. Now, sure, you could get into hypotheticals about what these entities actually do. They con you into coming back, they wipe your mind, and they can stick you in a situation that you didn't agree to and had no legal karma attached to it to justify. They could just do that to you if they didn't like you, right? You could go with ideas like that. But the point is, in the overwhelming majority of cases, so as to not blow their cover and ruin the energy extraction system that they have set up, they would err on the side of caution and using the decisions that you yourself made to convince you to return. In that way, you would probably be less likely to reject the situation in the same way that some people reject a foreign organ that is transplanted into their bodies. So they have to take medication to make sure that the body doesn't eject it as a foreign invader. there's probably something a little similar going on with the mind if it were put in a situation like the theoretical, hypothetical reincarnation soul trap, where the mind wipe is probably a part of getting the body, the spirit, to not reject the situation, because intuitively deep down it would probably know that something was going on like that on the deepest levels of the being. This is why the Eastern philosophies and religions that adhere to the idea of reincarnation taking place will be very reticent to ever step on a bug or kill anything of any sort of sentient capacity, because they're very wary of what the ramifications of that will be in their next life. In other words, karma is a part of the rules of the game in that scenario, to the point where a child with cancer would be the reincarnated being potentially of someone who murdered another person in their past life. That's what they get to experience the next time around as a karmic debt for what they did in the prior life. And in that way, if there is a reincarnation soul trap, the suffering that we witness here would be a direct product of personal responsibility. And you can see the logical problem then with how the majority of people discussing this subject point to the suffering as evidence of God being evil. But in the very scenario they are saying is the truth, a reincarnation soul trap, that suffering is almost entirely the result of what you did personally as an individual being in the incarnation prior, which has nothing to do with the creator of the whole thing in the first place. Do you see how that is a huge problem with the narrative that most of the people discussing this topic go with? Look at how evil everything is around us. Look at the suffering. Well, based on your theory of what's going on, that suffering is programmed into the game, right? That's programmed into it. They set the parameters, the rules of the game being karma, and then you are subject to that karma, whether or not it's an unfair imposition on you or not. That doesn't matter. Within the context of the game, that is what you step into when you're here. I'm not saying that's correct or that's the way it should be. Just pointing out the logical inconsistency in the people who are promoting this idea that I have the ultimate truth. I know about the reincarnation soul trap. Here is my evidence for that. Look at all the suffering around you. God is evil. That's the logical progression. And then from that, they proclaim that anyone who believes in the creator in a way that is benevolent is somehow delusional, because they can't see the truth of everything that's going on around them. Look at the suffering that your supposed God is allowing. It just totally removes any aspect of free will entirely from the situation. It's just in this context, free will is lifetime to lifetime based on the karma that you acquire. And that explains a lot of the suffering that you see all around you. Now, of course, getting back to the idea of nature itself being evil, well, again, we don't know how much of that was designed into this place and how much of that was created by something after the fact. The entire food chain functions on the principle of life consuming life, but we don't know how much of that was built into this place and how much of it was not built into this place. Let me give you an example. If you were the creator of this realm, whatever it is, and you were trying to figure out a way for the bodies to decompose after the spirits left the bodies. Let's say you were programming in the idea that no one would live forever in your realm that you create. Well, you have to practically come up with a way to dispose of the bodies that no longer function here. And so you come up with the idea, okay, I'll have all of these insects and other beings that will eat organic matter when it's no longer functioning. The point is, if you did a time-lapse photography of insects and other creatures breaking down a body, you could run that on a loop and say, look how evil and disgusting this place is. And it's like, from the perspective of your tiny human brain, that kind of makes sense. Yeah, this is gross. Why is it like this? But maybe from a different perspective, it's like, well, this is the way that you would have a self-contained terrarium that sort of cleaned itself once a body was no longer functioning, and assuming you didn't engage in the crazy rituals that human beings later came up with, or whoever is controlling human beings came up with and got them to do, like embalming a body and all these other crazy things that we do. You'd say, well, the body just sits on the ground and it begins to decompose through these processes that I created into it. Is that evil or is it practical? Well, it depends on your perspective. And that's why people say that suffering can teach. And then right away, somebody comes back and says, well, that's Stockholm Syndrome. That's you rationalizing your experience here. Maybe it is. Maybe you're in love with your captor in that way. But that is irrelevant as it relates to what this place actually is. Because you can be held captive by something that took over a creation that was benevolent when it started. So you might have Stockholm Syndrome as it relates to the beings that are controlling you. And you come up with reasons to justify your existence within that prison that they are holding you in. But that doesn't mean that the creation itself is evil in origins or was always designed as some sort of prison. And along those lines, the next issue is a lot of the people discussing this subject will imply that they know everything, that they figured out the ultimate truth, and then they offer you no solution. It's like, well, hold on a second. If you know this is what is going on for certain, and you're telling everyone that you're going to get out, and you're going to somehow help fix it or something, once you get out, how are you going to do that? And anytime you ask somebody this, they just deflect. They say, oh, well, I can't tell you. You have to figure it out on your own. It's like, well, hold on a second. That's like being in the middle of the desert. You're lost. And you don't know what to do. You're dying of thirst slowly. And all of a sudden, you come upon somebody who's drinking a glass of water. And you look at them and you say, oh my gosh, where'd you get that water? And they look at you and they say, well, I can't tell you where I got the water. You just have to figure it out on your own. And you're like, what? Really? Okay, fine. Let's say I have to find it on my own. You found it, though. Can you at least give me the map that will help me find it on my own? Can you at least point me in the right direction? And then they sit there and they say, oh, no, I can't even give you the map. You don't want somebody to tell you what to do. I can't do that. Figure it out on your own. You just want somebody to tell you what to do. It's like, no, I don't want to die of thirst and you have water. Please help me. Right? So somebody is being very disingenuous if they're coming to you saying, oh, I figured out how I'm going to leave. I know I'm not coming back. But they don't help you do that. Wouldn't that be the first thing you would do? I'll tell you, if I knew that, if I was certain that that was what is going on, which I'm not, but if I was certain of that and I knew how I was going to get out of it, I would share that with you. It would be the first thing that I would do. And then on top of that, the people who don't know any better are being programmed with the arrogance that you are portraying to them in that way. And so they're going to go into the experience thinking, oh, nobody can stop me. I'm out of here. I'm going right to where I belong. I'm so much more powerful than these beings are. I'm going to overcome this easily. And it's like, wait, hold on a second, guys. You don't think that an intelligence on the scale capable of creating a reincarnation soul trap would be able to figure out how to manipulate that mindset? They would just give you exactly what you wanted. They would give you the experience of you overcoming them. They'd come to you and say something, having read your mind, knowing your thoughts, every one of them that you had in your life, knowing what manipulated you and what didn't. They would come to you and figure out a way to convince you that you escaped. And then, once you thought you had escaped, they would come to you again and get you there. Okay, do you not understand that that is what would happen in that scenario? If you went into it with that arrogant attitude, like I said in the prior video, that you were going to overcome them with your mind, based on what you learned on YouTube. The ideas inherent to the reincarnation soul trap topic are very Gnostic in nature. And that's like saying pizza is a food. There are so many different versions of pizza in the same way there are so many different versions of quote-unquote Gnosticism. But still, that idea that your body's a trap, your spirit's trapped in it by something that created this world that's a miscreation, that's been around for thousands of years. It's not anything new that's being discussed in the reincarnation soul trap. Meaning, obviously, that idea isn't helping people escape. Do you see? If that's what's going on, the Gnostic tradition hasn't helped anyone get out of here or help any of us get out of here. You can go back to Marcion Christianity, which was saying at the time that the God of the Old Testament was different than the God that sent the man they call Jesus here. 2,000 years ago, that idea was out there. And that's another aspect of it as well, the time dilation issue, the time scale issue. That which we call the Creator, that which created this for us, on its scale of existence, it could be aware of this problem for a total of our 10 seconds. But to us, it's thousands of years. In the same way that your body can have a tumor growing and growing and growing for years before you ever even realize it's there, before you ever even have a symptom that you view as a big problem that needs to be addressed. In the mind of that which created the whole thing, it could already be addressed, but it's going to take a long time to manifest here. That thought traveling through the neuronal structure metaphorically, from the mind of creation into this section of its body, quote unquote. And be mindful of the fact that the promotion of the hypothetical reincarnation soul trap would argue against the idea of different timescales being a factor here. Most of the people who talk about this kind of thing would refer to that as, again, some kind of Stockholm syndrome. Oh, you're just down here taking your abuse, taking all of that suffering, and saying, oh, it's okay because it's just on a different time scale than what's really going on at the highest of all the scales. But this isn't some theory that I'm talking about here. This is a fundamental truth of our existence. Time exists differently depending on the scale of perception perceiving it. Because time and the perception of it is an element of the structure of reality itself. And if you doubt what I just said, think about the fact that we refer to dogs as living in dog years compared to human years. Someone asks, how old is your dog? And you say, oh, the dog is 10 years old. And you think, oh, that's old for a dog, 10 years, wow. But from our human perception of time, 10 years is nothing. But we know from our observance of the world and the things within it, that these beings we refer to as dogs, which are relatives of wolves, experience time on a different scale than we do. To the point that 10 human years is like 70 dog years. If you were going to make an equivalency between the two. Accordingly, you know that time is an element of structural reality that varies based upon the consciousness perceiving it and the vehicle through which that consciousness perceives it, i.e. scale. And to my point, that's just the difference between humans and dogs, which are pretty close to each other perceptually speaking, as beings, as sentient creatures. Now, imagine the difference between our perception and the perception of the highest scale, the mind of God. What might the possible difference in time scale be with that? Which is, of course, the whole point of bringing this into the equation. The idea of suffering here versus what the mind of God would perceive that suffering as on its time scale. In response to those who would say, why would God let this happen? How could it allow all of this suffering? How could it allow a reincarnation soul trap to be constructed here, if that's what's going on? If that's how you want to perceive the problems in this realm currently? Well, there is your potential answer. In other words, both of those theories could be simultaneously true. It could be a reincarnation soul trap that was created by an intelligence that exists beyond our scale of perception. It took this realm over in that way, creating its trap, its web around it. And as a part of that, it manipulated beings here to create the food chain where life consumes life. It altered biology in that way, in the same way that viruses are creations in a lab somewhere that are designed to alter the body. We can see that in the present moment, so why do you think it wasn't going on hundreds and hundreds of years ago? Thousands of years ago. Slowly altering biology to create this food chain where life consumes life. In other words, that wasn't the idea that the Creator had in mind when it created this place. But as a part of free will, even its own angels, quote unquote, were able to make decisions that would lead to something like this taking place. And in that context, going back to the beginning, you too have your own free will within the reincarnation cycle. But the idea that this realm is evil and there is no God, or if there is a God, it is evil, that just adds to the nihilism that they want to create during this time, that life is meaningless, it's pointless, why am I here? I hate it here. I hate everyone. Like, that's where it takes you, you know? And in that way, having that mentality, they get you to turn your back on that which created you. Think about what would be going on in your body if your awareness found itself inside of a tumor. You would have a vague familiarity with your surroundings. It would have a lot of things in common with the role that you used to play as a cell in the body. You would be fed in a similar way. You would carry out functions in a similar way. A lot of it would seem familiar, but yet at the same time, you would be controlled by a different energy that had a different signature than the energy that you were carrying out the functions of prior to being subsumed within the tumor. That's very similar to what is going on here with us in this place, whatever it is. Meaning, if we are metaphorically inside of a tumor within a larger body, as a cell in the tumor, what would your response be if someone asked you where it is that you were and what it was that created you? Well, you would have this cancerous energy influencing your mind, being very involved in your thoughts, and you would see a lot of its actions, how it was treating other cells in the body, how it was taking advantage of them, how it was trying to mind control them into joining your quest for growth. You would see a lot of that, and it would seem very evil in the context of what the body is designed to do, how it is all designed to function harmoniously in homeostasis. It would be extremely difficult to answer that question. It would probably depend on the moment that you were asked what you thought about that. Some days you would think, well, I can still remember the functions that I used to carry out in the body before I was trapped in here, and I know that I come from somewhere that had a different intent than this. But at the same time, the energy that became detached from the body created the growth on its own. As a part of its own free will, it decided, I'm going to create this because it became disconnected in that way. on its own and started to grow. So in that sense, it was its own creation. And it created the reality within the tumor and all the cells that existed inside of the tumor. And maybe as a cell stuck inside there on some days, if you were asked that question, you would say, yeah, this is an evil creation created by something that doesn't have my best interests in mind. It's using my energy. It's recycling me and other cells over and over again. It's wiping our memory over and over again. As new cells come in and old cells die off. It's recycling us. We get in here and we can't get out. And yet there's still that memory of where it is you actually come from. So you see, metaphorically, if something like that is going on here, to say that God is evil is a very misguided approach. There are plausible arguments to make on both sides to quote-unquote prove that the creator of wherever it is we are is evil, or it is benevolent and it was taken over by something. Something detached from it and started to grow outside of it. But as it relates to the nuts and bolts of that, I mean, our tiny human brains just can't comprehend it. We can't comprehend that level. I mean, I shouldn't speak for everyone. There are probably people out there who do comprehend it and could explain it to other people. But if that's the case, they're not on YouTube, because I've never heard anything like that in a long time anyway. You're inside of the tumor and you're pointing to all of these examples of suffering as evidence that the creator of the tumor is evil, but the creator of the tumor, metaphorically, was a part of your body before it happened. So how can it be evil in origin? It's only evil temporarily, currently. In other words, if you assume that reincarnation is a fact and it's actually happening here, well, that could have been the setup that existed before anything happened here. It could have just been set up for a reincarnation loop to be taking place, maybe without a memory wipe. But even then, you don't know. Maybe that was the design, to wipe memory in between incarnations to make each experience memorable and meaningful on its own. Or maybe the design was you remembered your past lives, everyone you had, and you built on them in that way. And then the detached energy came up with the idea to wipe memory in between incarnations and use your energy for itself to grow. Either way, it is completely beyond the scope of your mind and its ability to perceive higher scales to look at that situation and claim that its existence means that God is evil, right? Or that creation itself is evil. Just because you find yourself in this situation where there are evil things happening all around you. And more importantly, in both scenarios, no matter which one it was, again, we're assuming reincarnation is a fact here, and that there is a reincarnation soul trap in place on top of that reincarnation. We're assuming that for the sake of this thought experiment. Either way, if that is going on, there is free will involved. Even in the case where your mind is being wiped in between incarnations, they have to allow the free will in order to convince you that you need to go back. They have to allow you to make your own decisions so that they can use those decisions against you. If they forced you to do everything, it wouldn't work. If in this line of thinking you are as powerful as you think you are, and you're going to get into this situation when you get out of here and totally overpower them with your mind based on what you know, well, obviously they have to deceive you in that way in order to con you into coming back here. But even in that situation, you have the free will to make your own decisions. Which means that you are creating your own circumstance in the reincarnation loops. No matter what you say about how wrong it is that this is taking place, and trust me, I agree, if that's what's going on, there's no way to say that it's correct. At least my tiny human brain can't wrap my mind around that being correct. I think we all have a problem with that. But even in that scenario, you have the personal responsibility for the situation that you end up in. And so it is not correct, based on that, to assert that the evil and suffering you see around you is proof that God is evil or God doesn't exist. I hope that makes sense. Nihilism is very alluring, and given what we are going through right now, I get the appeal. And that's about as nihilistic as you can get to adhere to this philosophy where everything is evil, God is evil, you lose faith in humanity, in the world, in your own life. You start doing things that are dangerous because you don't even care if you're here anymore when you assimilate this energy fully into your being in the way that it's presented. The last thing that you want to do right now is lose your faith. That's all we have, man. That's all we got. And hopefully I've went through this well enough to make you at least reconsider the idea of whether or not you should have that faith in that which created you, regardless of the circumstance that you find yourself in. Don't let somebody tell you that's Stockholm Syndrome to have faith in God.